Times by Charles Dickens is an unusual novel in the Dickensian corpus. It is both Dickens' shortest novel, only one outside of London, and it comes right in the middle of his career. It will raise issues about social progress, it'll raise issues about the Victorian take on the Industrial Revolution, and it's also an important way of reflecting on what the novel meant in the Victorian age. Let's first take a look at a few passages of the text, and then a conversation between me and my colleague Dr. Glatt to expand on some of the larger themes and questions surrounding the text. Hard Times is set in Coketown. This is the only of Dickens's novels completely set outside of London, and Coketown, though a fictional place, is a stand-in for what was called the Great Towns, the industrial centers that had boomed during the Industrial Revolution, that peaked during Queen Victoria's reign, during Victorian England, places like Manchester, Leeds, and Liverpool. It is a city that in some ways is a laboratory for many of the ideas that Dickens found most reprehensible about how to organize society, about how to treat people, and also how to educate children. Let's look first at three discrete set passages, three sections of the novel that represent Dickens's purpose in this text. The first is right at the beginning. The story begins in chapter 1 with Mr. Gradgrind visiting a school that he is sponsoring. He is the leader of this town, member of parliament, and what Gradgrind says in this caricature, exaggerated opening is, "Now I want facts." Facts are going to be the language of Coketown, the organizing principle and philosophy of the place. What I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are what are wanted in life. Plant nothing else. Root out everything else. Facts, nothing else will ever be of service to them. This is the principle on which I raise my own children. This is the principle on which I bring up these children. Stick to facts, sir. Sticking to facts. Fact, fact, fact. Hard fact, reason, and rational organization of life. That is Gradgrind's philosophy in his own life, raising his own children, and it is the philosophy that he applies, and also extracts from Coketown, this city. The story begins as we can see, in a schoolroom. The speaker, Mr. Gradgrind, is this very serious, square, completely factual person. In this life, we want nothing but facts. Nothing but facts. Facts, of course, Thomas Gradgrind, and here he'll be introduced. This speaker, facts are in opposition to fancy, to imagination, even in some senses to pleasure. Gradgrind is not, although he's harsh, Hard Times, and the title is the title which is reflected in so many elements of this text about the alienation of time from workers, alienation of time from children, and there is a constant relationship between the workers of Coketown, the factory workers, the hands as they're called, and the children, the Gradgrind children, and others, Cecilia Jupe and other characters in this text. There is a great deal of how they are alienated from time, alienated from nature, from pleasure, and Dickens is both lampooning, he is ridiculing, parodying this world that is so harsh, the hard time in which they live, and the relationship, the hardness, the austerity, the seriousness about their lives in opposition to the times in which they live. Gradgrind here is calling for a new philosophy that is trying to bring up both productive as well as profitable future citizens, in which anything but fact is unnecessary and gratuitous. He comes to this class where Choke'em Child, a ridiculous name, Choke Those Childs is the name of the schoolmaster, the headmaster, and he tries to educate, to give an example. He calls, as you can see here, on girl number 20. They don't have names in his mind. They all just have purposes. This reflects what is, to Dickens, an absurd situation in his day, where a rational, almost calculating approach to society has replaced any sort of individual, empathetic relationship between people. He's referring here to a utilitarian philosophy. Utilitarianism, an idea that was developed by a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham. Sometimes it's even referred to as Benthamism, a philosophy that has its own merits, but was abused, exploited to come up with an idea that whatever can make society function best is what we should do. That what can achieve the greatest prosperity and indeed happiness for the most number of people, that is our recommended course of action. Of course, it leads to thinking of people as uses, as needs, as elements of that can how people fit into the larger prosperity, empire, cultural project, social project is what matters most. There is no place in this world for anything like pleasure, fancy, fun, and, as we'll see in a second, amusement. So the facts that begin the text. The city is a city that is, as we'll see now in this next chapter, the beginning of chapter 5, a city that is founded on this principle of harshness, of facts, of a kind of cost-benefit analysis. Coketown, to which Mr. and here you can see it is an extension, it's a replication of that industrialized, polluted place that Blake talked about in London. Here in 1850, 1854 is the year of this novel, when Dickens was at the height of his celebrity, power, and acclaim. And we'll talk in a few minutes about how the book was read and released in its own time. But it is a horrible place. It's a town of red brick. Everything is harsh. Everything is unnatural. It is completely blackened by the smoke. Coke is from the term of this smelting material used in producing steel iron. It is a town of machinery, of tall chimneys. It is polluted. The Black Canal, the water it smells horrific from the chemical pollution. This is what Coketown is, and it is a place that is inseparable from the work that sustains it. The people are just workers. They are just not even people, they're hands. These individuals who are subjugated, the working class, subjugated to the factory conditions of the Industrial Revolution, are not even people. They're just assets to create greater capital. And of course, it's this kind of situation that leads Marx, who was in England for this whole entire period, exiled from his native Germany, to come up with his ideas of Marxism about capital. The town so sacred to fact, it is a place that revolves around fact, so triumphant, fact. And the city and the workers have this kind of parallel to the children. Now, there are a few children I want to just note here, and this is the next of the passages I just want to mention. In chapter 8, the two Gradgrind children who have been brought up in this horrific arrangement of their father, Thomas Gradgrind, the two main characters that the text focuses on, little Tom who grows up, and Lou. They are people who are told their entire lives, Louisa, they are told never to wonder. And in a nighttime conversation, Louisa and Tom, who early in the book had been censured, rebuked for peering into a circus tent, and their father thought, this is absurd, horrific. What has he done wrong to raise children who want to look into the frivolous, trivial absurdities and entertainments of a circus? Here they speak to each other and bare their souls, and they are scarred children who don't really have any affective, emotional way of speaking to each other. They have this late night conversation. Louisa begins. She says, "Tom, I wonder." And little Tom and Mr. Gradgrind, their father, who is listening in, says, and this raises alarms from immediately, "Never wonder. You are never to wonder. Never engage imagination and never engage fancy." While this is exaggerated and it's a character, and it's one reason that this text, Dickens' shortest, has slightly less rounded characters, it is calling attention to a real concern. what does the novel do? Is the novel the space for creating that wonder? Is it a place also for educating? Is it a place for introducing facts about more sordid parts of society? Never wonder. This is the philosophy that Gradgrind introduced in the opening pages, laid out, elaborated. Never wonder. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, that can settle everything. A utilitarian approach to life, strictly rational, strictly social, can lead you to the greatest good. Bring to me, says Macogum child, yonder baby, just able to walk, and I will engage it that it will never wonder. The purpose of education is to drive out, to uproot the natural, the beauty, and to remove that propensity for wonder. Later in this chapter, they are still speaking to each other, and they are exercising. They're sort of struggling with their frustration, being told never to wonder, and they realize that the facts that they've been given are not enough for them to lead their lives, to have productive and full lives. It leads Tom to nihilism, anger, violence. It leads Louisa to some terrible decisions and enormous regret. But it is a kind of abuse. It is a lack in their life. Even as their parents tell them over and over again to never be, as he says here, never be wondering. And this is an instinct, it's a reflex. They can't help themselves but try to wonder. The last section that I'll share with you is when Gradgrind, Bounderby, when some of these factory owners, the leaders of the town, visit the members of an itinerant traveling circus group who serve as the counter, as the foils for this idea. And Sleary, the head of this group, they ride horses, they do tricks with horses, says, and he speaks with this absurd and it's Dickensian, over the top lisp. He can't say the S sound. And he tells Bounderby, Gradgrind, that people cannot always be simply educated. They cannot be made into machines, automatons, factories, little pieces, little cogs in the great social gears. This is his statement in taking leave of this girl Cecilia, Sissy, who was a member of this angelic figure who is all too good, had been a member of the circus troupe. Her father abandons her, and the Gradgrinds adopt her, and eventually seek to sort of restart her life, take control of her life. When you're grown up and married, don't forget us. Don't forget the horse riding. And the main point is this: try to be kind to us, for people must be amused, Squire. People must be amused, Squire. Somehow. People need entertainment. People need pleasure. They cannot always be working. They cannot always be learning. There's the parallel between what children do and what adults do. Always working, turning the school into a miniature version of factory, turning adults into just these automatons. Always working. They cannot always be learning. They make the best of it, make the best of us, of the people who provide just pleasure, the circus troupe, who do no actual practical good. There is nothing practical from what we do. We, the bringers of entertainment, may be representatives of the novel, something I'll talk about in a little bit with my colleague, Dr. Glatt. Make the best of us, not the worst. That is how we make our living, by bringing pleasure. And I lay down the philosophy of the subject when I may. Make the best of us, not the worst. Compassion, empathy is part of what the arts, pleasure, and entertainment, and as he calls it here, amusement afford. How this text fits into that long conversation that we've been discussing about the didactic versus realistic, the didactic versus the entertainment and amusement, the pleasure of literature, and how this text somehow tries to do a little bit of both, is part of what I'll discuss now with my colleague, Dr. Kara Glad. Dr. Glad, thank you so much. It's good to have you back, and thank you for your time to help us understand Dickens's Hard Times. So we said we were going to talk about a number of things in this text. The Victorian novel, maybe we'll begin with that. Now, Hard Times is a little eccentric, it's a little unusual, but it's a frequently taught text, as the students know, because of its brevity and how it crystallizes so many of the issues that certainly Dickens was interested in, perhaps the reformist, the Victorian novel epitomizes. In what sense does Hard Times illustrate those concerns of the Victorian novel, and what exactly is Dickens doing? This is a long way away from Defoe and the early 18th century novels.
Hi, so first of all, thank you for having me. I always love talking about Hard Times. So, as you said, Hard Times is atypical, especially for Dickens, just because, believe it or not, this is a really short novel. Hard Times comes to about, in most editions, 300 pages, whereas for Dickens, more typical would be an 800-page novel that really gives a more encyclopedic kind of look at different portraits of society, that brings different plot lines, sets them against each other, so that you get this kind of web. And by the way, I do want to emphasize, while for practical reasons, obviously few of you will have the opportunity within this program to read an 800-page novel. It's not realistic within a normal semester. These novels are not long just to be long. There's a rumor some of you may have heard that people will always ask me, didn't Dickens, he wrote by the word, right? He was paid by the word, which is not really true of Victorian novelists. Clearly, just like today, maybe if you write like a really long hardcover book, you may be able to charge more money for it than you would for like a slim paperback volume. Or maybe a better comparison, if you're writing a TV show and it goes for 6 years, you're going to earn more money than if that TV show goes for 2 years. Victorian novelists aren't being paid by the word. They're being paid sort of by installment. So the novel will run. These novels were serialized. I don't know if you guys have talked about this. So that they are more similar, really, to the experience, at least pre Netflix, the experience of a TV show. So some of you may remember from the pre-Netflix era that you'd have a show and maybe it would be a Sunday night TV show, and then the next episode would air the following Sunday night. You wouldn't binge watch it all at once. I know I'm now talking about ancient history, even in the TV landscape. But that's really how Victorian novels worked. They were published in journals, in newspapers, and they would either be Hard Times is weekly. Some of them would be weekly publications, some of them would be monthly publications. Usually it would be a few chapters at the time. And people would be reading each week to find out what happened next, in the same way you would for more typically today for a TV show. So that you have this serialized form. But you're not explicitly, Dickens in particular, by the way, if he had any problem, it was often that he would write too much for the weekly publication, where he'd have notes and you'd see him writing in his notes, no, I have to save this for next week. It's also important to know someone like Dickens was basically, for his entire adult life, was never without a novel. So there really wasn't a lot of pressure for him. Uh, when he finished one novel, he was always going to just begin another one. So the reason the novels were so long was not because, although Dickens was very aware of money and commercial issues, he had no pressure to make his novels long. Actually, length is really about a commitment to representing a sort of broad swath of society and to say, really, we're going to challenge the epic. So, thinking of the classical epics, the Greek and Roman epics where you would tell tales of heroes, the Victorian novelists are really sitting there and saying, well, why should I just have to tell tales of heroes? Why is that the important story? So I have to tell the story of the Trojan War. Victorian novelists will talk about, termed by the novelist George Eliot, or most associated with George Eliot, the home epic. The idea that ordinary experience is also worthy of extended novelistic treatment, and also that the world has become so complex and society has become so interrelated that we can't just tell the story of, say, a few upper middle class people. That story, increasingly in industrial society, that story is going to inevitably become intertwined with the story of people who may seem at first to be completely disconnected, say our main character. And in Hard Times, even though it's a much shorter version of that, Um, and there are commercial reasons that Hard Times is shorter. Dickens himself owned a journal. It wasn't doing quite so well. He said, "Oh, let me get a novel," and did plan this as a shorter novel than most. But even in Hard Times, it's sort of a miniature version that crystallizes some of these ideas, where you do have. I understand not all of you read Hard Times, but um, you do have a more or less middle class family. That's part of some of it, and then you have the factory workers. So you have the plot with Steve Blackpool and Rachel, so that you get the much humbler classes as well. In a longer novel, you might have even had a couple of other plot lines introduced. You undoubtedly would have, but even here, the idea that it's showing this interplay between different classes, different worlds, and setting them against one another. So, in that respect, Hard Times is fairly typical. It's maybe, I think, another difference. Hard Times is more overtly political than Dickens frequently is. It's also somewhat more what we might call allegorical, where there's a sense that the dominant literary mode in this time is realism, the idea that we're supposed to be, as if you're a novelist, you want to be representing the world as it is. You don't, you, there's some attempt at a fidelity to the conditions of actual life.
Yeah, and no one's ever
Um,
met anybody like Sleary or any of
right.
them, Bounderby
And,
or Gradgrind.
in
The
all of,
characters are caricatures here.
right. And it's important to mention that Dickens in particular, and this is a highly relative term. And believe me, since I've dealt with a lot of this myself in my own work, scholars will argue whether to the extent that realism is like even a thing that really exists, what it means. Like people have arguments, experts in the field have arguments about this. But at least in a general sense, the characters in Hard Times are somewhat more caricatured and are somewhat more stereotyped than even in the average Dickens novel. And Dickens is more known for somewhat deliberately caricatured figures than, say, someone like George Eliot, who's a more realistic and naturalistic writer. Why is he
Does
doing
that come? Yeah. Why is that from a reform
that?
agenda? Is he trying to
Right?
engage the, as I mentioned,
I
citizens utilitarian theses of the day, or
Yeah, I think in this case, it's not a coincidence that Hard Times among Dickens's works of this period is particularly far in the spectrum of a kind of moral fable, with particularly unrealistic characters. Because part of what's going on in Hard Times is Dickens pushing back against a certain type of culture that mostly has to do with things outside the novel, but also I think is even a kind of questioning of realism, saying, you know what, maybe we're losing something in the attempt to be so focused on what really is. Maybe there's a place for like the imagination and fancy and the kind of purity of just inventive play that we've lost by saying we have to focus on what is.
on the mirror?
um,
Yeah.
and exactly. So, and I okay, go ahead.
And fancy is, of course, a major theme of this text.
Yeah,
It's
right. So I exactly because fact and fancy are such an overt part of the text, it's particularly easy to see this and say, well, formally, what he's doing by having this kind of, in some ways, you do have sort of classic realist scenes where you're describing the factory, you're describing the streets. So there is the kind of minute description of everyday people and scenes that you see in realism. But the fact and fancy interplay that you see explicitly thematically in the text is also stylistically showing up in this difference between the kind of classic mimetic realism versus a more space for more imaginative play than you sometimes get in novels of the period.
you've said a little bit about how he's trying to push back and resist some of the emphasis or perhaps even obsession on the realist tradition as it had evolved over the preceding 130 years. But he also talks overtly, the text, not
Yeah.
Dickens, but the text talks overtly about the didactic versus entertainment dichotomy, which also accompanies the novel from
Yeah.
its earliest roots. And every major novelist, Fielding and Johnson, they all have something to say about this. Is this text firmly coming down on the side of the people must be amused, of people must be entertained and amused, and that is the purpose? But it also at the same time is illustrating the lives of the factory workers, and it is giving plenty of play to the facts of the world and description of the world as it is. Does
I
Dickens
think
have a state? Does Dickens have a position on this?
what I think is interesting here is because you do have multiple plots sort of playing against each other, Dickens clearly likes Sleary and he likes the kind of circus world. I don't think he looks at that as fully the real world. If you had to look
Hmm.
at, and there's a question of whether, I think sometimes people have criticized Hard Times, and it's a criticism that you see in other Victorian novels for not being terribly realistic. I don't, in terms of its political solutions. Um, I don't think Victorian novelists necessarily saw themselves as bound to provide politically valid solutions. They looked at themselves as drawing light to certain issues and specifically to use individual stories that maybe could happen or resemble people that happen. They're saying, I'm interested in the individual. The government may be interested in numbers and statistics and data. We need to inculcate sympathy. What my role is to make the average guy on the street more sympathetic and more aware of the lives of those around them by dramatizing individual stories. So when you look at someone like Sleary, yeah, I don't think Dickens thinks we can all join the circus and live there forever. Sleary is being proposed as an antidote, and a deliberately extreme antidote to another kind of value. And it's something that Dickens celebrates. But yeah, at the end of the day, I don't think he's saying Sleary's the answer. We should all join the circus. Um, there's an understand.
Shouldn't all make our way to the circus
Yeah,
and
there's
find our
something.
future?
There's something almost Edenic about that. Like, if we could live in the state of innocence forever, that might be lovely, but that's not the world we live in. So it's nice to have Sleary as a kind of antidote and a counter to everyone else. But yes, to an extent, people must be entertained, make the best of us, not the worst. These are kind of mottos for the novel. Yet I think because the novel clearly moves beyond Sleary, and Sleary is not someone who's adequate to meet all of the various challenges, he's representing a kind of simple morality that is not necessarily the be all and end all, but which we also shouldn't forget as we become more sophisticated.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for complicating that. And I'll just add also that Sissy Jupe, who is this younger
Yeah.
character, the most angelic figure of the circus troupe, in her own background, serves as a sort of subtle criticism of what is often portrayed in the novel as the communal solidarity of the circus troupe. For after all, Sissy's own father abandons her. So there is
Right.
also this sort of capricious life living completely by fancy and the desires of the moment can have its underside. As we bring things to a close, I want to summarize for everyone a few things that you've been kind enough and generous to share. One, the way that we read novels today is actually to binge watch it, to binge read it. We read it all at once, which is not the contemporary way that these texts were produced, which was under its own economic and commercial interest of the time. Politically, these texts are still engaged, but it is literature as a separate institution from politics, perhaps as a ballast or a counterbalance to the political interest in numbers and engineering society, and instead focusing on the individual. And in addition, the role of fancy, imagination, as having some space as a continuation, or an elaboration on the realist novel tradition, which is not that old when Dickens and the other Victorian novelists come around, but they're taking it to a different level by portraying not just the the middling class sort of individual, as we said, as you mentioned, as you taught in Defoe, in Richardson, but also the entire texture and the fabric of society, all the different aspects of it. Dickens, of course, and you also mentioned, by the way, and which I just want to also flag, another point you made is that that's a reason for the character sort of exaggerated figures of Dickens. And I admire your invitation, and I hope I can take it up as well as our students to read Bleak House and and all your other favorites, which you have written, as not to speak, of course, Great Expectations and Oliver Twist, some of the other classically frequently taught texts. What is the legacy of these texts in afterwards as the novel develops? Is this the high watermark of the novels? People think of the British Victorian novel of this long 19th century period, the long reign of Queen Victoria, writers such as Dickens and George Eliot and Trollope and Thackeray and many others as the sort of the high watermark of the novel, an era that sort of not repeated. We don't teach as a compulsory course the modern period, although you personally do teach that. How does the Victorian novel look to, from a 20th and 21st century perspective, and the legacy of especially English literature?
It's interesting. I think the Victorian novel, I think, perfects a certain kind of form that begins even in the late 17th century, but certainly throughout the 18th century. I try to avoid making it a kind of, well, we're all working up to like the 19th century, but
that's often the trajectory. Yeah, that's kind of the
kind of are. Where most
cliche.
people will suggest that there are ways in which even something like Robinson Crusoe or the works of Richardson are sort of a precursor to the 19th century, some of the 19th century works, and that in terms of the traditional novel, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, the Victorian novel is still in many ways unsurpassed. What I think starts happening after that is you get in the modernist and postmodern period people who start, and in order, of course, to move on, you also have to start with the model. You have people that start doing more experimental things and saying things like, for instance, well, what if I reimagined what realism would be? Like, what if I went to something, for instance, more hyper realistic? So, for instance, what if instead of just saying, I followed the life of a non epic human being, I just followed some middle class guy through his various struggles? Suppose I said, I'm going to follow this one person through a single day. Suppose I said, I'm going to really take it to its extreme. Suppose I did things that were more, when you get to the postmodern period, where instead of saying, I'm going to try to make things realistic and I'm going to put a mirror up to the world, I'm going to remind you all the time that this is only fictional and play with the difference between fiction and reality. So I think in the 20th century and now in the 21st century, you see different attempts to sort of say, now that they've perfected this mold, how do we play with it and do new things with it? But still implicitly, I think within that, you're always kind of seeing a reaction to this model, where even texts that are throwing the Victorian novel far into the rearview mirror, that's going to be, those plots are going to be the things they're reacting against to a great extent. And I think that's still, and certainly, by the way, again, we're talking about novels because we're the English department and that's what we do. But if we talk more broadly about narrative, I think it could be an artificial distinction. I've heard people say, you could make a case that the great American novel is a TV show. You don't necessarily have to have this strict division between what's happening in literature and what's happening in, say, long form television narratives. In many ways, some modern TV serials, you could say, are the inheritor of that tradition, even more maybe than some modern authors, as our culture has changed.
Excellent. That's a great bridge to how we get to, from Dickens and the other writers of this era, the Victorian era, for whom the novel, and for Victorian readers, I hope I'm not wrong in saying this, the novel is kind of a touchstone of that era. We think of Victorian England, we think of the novel. Tennyson and the Rossettis notwithstanding, despite there being great poetry of that era, it's the novel that stands as the symbol, the cultural symbol, and that how we get from that work, that genre, to as a bridge to Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, thinking about how one individual might think, or several individuals might think through just one day, to Faulkner, and then to Philip Roth, and to, as I was going to ask you, are the dramatic series of our time, of the 21st century, is that the natural heir to the Victorian novel? I think you answered that very beautifully. Okay, thank you so much, Carrie. You're always so generous. Dr. Glatt, thank you for sharing from your expertise. Okay, take care.